I'm Professor Melissa and I love to cruise. In this video, we're going to talk about whether or not you need a passport to cruise and all the documents you need to ensure smooth sailing. Almost daily, from friends who are embarking on their first ever cruise or on cruise travel groups on social media, I see the same question asked: do I need a passport to cruise? The short answer, no, but under certain conditions. The long answer, no, but you should. And I'll tell you why in just a minute. First, let's talk about what cruise lines require and why. If you're embarking on a closed loop sailing, and we'll talk about that in a moment, most cruise lines only require an original birth certificate in combination with a valid government issued ID. So you need either the certificate ID combo or a valid passport. And it's important that that passport does not expire within the next 6 months. For children, you really just need the birth certificate or passport. These documents verify the identity of all passengers that are cruising to make sure it's a safe onboard environment, especially because you're going to be crossing borders into different countries, and they all have different laws and requirements. Now, what many cruisers may not realize is that cruise lines run passenger manifest by Customs and Border Protection. Would-be cruisers with felonies may not be permitted entry into certain countries, and those with certain open warrants may find arresting officers waiting for them upon disembarkation. Now, let's talk about the difference between a closed loop and an open loop itinerary, because this will determine the type of documents that you need. To determine if you need a passport to cruise or if the birth certificate ID combination is sufficient, it is important to know the difference between these two, closed loop and open loop. The difference will determine whether or not you do have to have a passport. First, let's talk about closed loop itineraries. Closed loop itineraries are sometimes called round trip cruises, and these refer to journeys that begin and end at the same port of embarkation, and that port happens to be in the United States. U.S. citizens sailing on a closed loop itinerary that originate and end in the United States and starts and ends at the same port generally do not need a passport, even if that cruise stops at international ports of call. Now, while this is the general rule, it is important to consult with the cruise line and read carefully your travel documents provided, because there are sometimes some exceptions, and you want to make sure you're confirming the identification requirements. Some cruise lines are different too. Virgin Voyages, for instance, at one point for a long time required passports of all passengers, regardless of whether it was on a closed loop or open loop sailing, although they have since loosened this requirement. Let's talk about open loop itineraries, because these are going to require a passport. Open loop itineraries are also sometimes called open jaw cruises or one-way cruises. And these involve departures that begin and end at different ports of embarkation. So this might be a Panama Canal sailing that leaves from Fort Lauderdale and disembarks on the West Coast. These itineraries often include international ports of call that require passengers to cross international borders during their voyage. Other examples of open loop itineraries include transatlantic cruises between Europe and North America, or cruises that sail between United States and South America or other continents. As I mentioned, that popular Panama Canal route, that is going to be considered an open jaw or an open loop itinerary, because you're going to embark at one port and you're going to disembark on another port. So why is it important? If you're sailing an open loop cruise, you do need a passport. Regardless of citizenship, most countries mandate the use of passports for entry and exit, making it essential for passengers to possess this important travel document. Now, it's also important to note that there are certain countries that may also impose visa requirements or other entry restrictions. And this just underscores the importance of thorough pre-travel research and preparation. And by that, I mean, read your cruise documents. It's going to tell you on there. So it is important to look at those documents. If you have a question, always ask the cruise line. Don't ask people on social media, because they will specify the things that you need, like visas. If you do need a visa, these are generally pretty simple to get online. You go, you fill out a form, you pay a small fee, but they do require a little bit of effort prior to your sailing. And if you don't do that in advance, you might not be able to enter that country. So these documents, which range from passports to visas, they're more than just formalities. They're necessary preconditions for enjoying a cruise experience. These documents are essential to guaranteeing the safety of all cruisers and their security, and to make sure that everyone is complying with various international requirements for each port of call's country. Now, when traveling with a passport, it's really important that you verify that you're in compliance with what's called the 6-month passport validity rule. This states that passports are valid for 6 months beyond the period of your intended date of visit when you're in a foreign country. Even if your passport is valid during your cruise and it doesn't expire until right after you return home, it may be considered invalid if it expires in less than 6 months. A lot of cruisers don't know about this or they forget about it, so always check that expiration date. Do you need a passport to cruise? As we've covered, US travelers on a closed loop itinerary generally do not need a passport to cruise. In the case of those open jaw itineraries or open loop itineraries that I talked about, most cruise lines are going to require a passport. But to be sure, always check your cruise documents and check with the cruise line. And while a passport to cruise is sometimes not required, I always recommend that you have one. Why? Because it is unlikely, but you may encounter a medical emergency that requires you to be taken off the ship and hospitalized or treated at a foreign port of call. And that ship leaves without you. Well, once you're well enough to get back home, you have to get back home. And if you don't have a passport with you, you're stuck. Again, this is uncommon, but I've personally seen it happen many times to fellow cruisers on my own sailings. Now, another scenario, probably more likely one, is you become a pier runner. And that means someone that misses the ship, or you're not even close enough to run the pier. You lose track of time on a port day, you don't get to that ship on time, and that ship takes off without you on board. Now, when this happens, it's almost always the cruiser's responsibility to get him or herself either back home or fly to the next port of call to meet back up with the ship. In this case, you're also going to need, you guessed it, a passport. So even if you don't need it, you should have it. So another common question and misunderstood issue is whether or not cruisers who are sailing with their passport should take their passports with them to shore on port days or leave it back behind in the stateroom. My advice, leave it behind, and I'll tell you why. What I personally do, I always bring a copy of my passport and a valid original government issued ID with me on port days, and I leave that passport back in the stateroom safe. Now, of course, in the unlikely event that I miss that return to ship time and I miss the ship, leaving me stranded at port, I know I'll need my real passport to fly myself back home on my own dime from a foreign port of call. So why then would I recommend people leave their passports back on the ship? And why is that what I do? Well, according to John Heald, who's Carnival Cruise Line's brand ambassador, Carnival's policy for handling passports in the case of a passenger missing the ship's departure is this, and I quote from one of his Facebook posts. In case of an emergency, which meant that you could not return to the ship, we do indeed have a policy in place. Your passport would be collected from the guest cabin, including retrieving it specifically from the safe, and by our housekeeping officer, the guest services officer, and someone from our security team. We would then return the passport to the ship's agent. We have one in every single port who takes care of the ship's needs during the time there. The agent will return the original passport to you. So again, if your passport's back in the safe, you miss the ship, they know you're not there, they know you're missing it, they get your passport out of the safe, leave it with the port authority for you to retrieve later. Because of this policy, I know that in the unlikely event I get left behind, I'll be able to get my passport from that port agent and then use that to fly back home. That's why it's important not just to leave that passport behind in the stateroom, but to specifically leave it in the stateroom safe, which is always good practice anyway to ensure that it stays safe and secure. Now, some people get super anxious at the thought of leaving their passport behind when they're in a foreign country, even knowing the cruise line policies. So if that's something that's gonna make you super anxious, just bring it with you. I prefer not to because I know my risk if I take my passport with me is much higher of that passport ultimately getting lost by me or unfortunately stolen than for me to ever miss the return to ship time. So for me, I prefer to leave it behind, but you've got to do what feels best for you.